I paid someone to adopt my daughter. They brought her back the same night. The Calderon family stood on my doorstep at midnight holding Maya's hand and looking like they'd witnessed something that shattered them. Mrs. Calderon's expensive silk blouse was torn at the shoulder, and Mr. Calderon had a bleeding scratch across his left cheek that he kept touching with shaking fingers. Maya stood between them in the yellow dress I'd put her in that morning, her dark curls still perfect in the braids I'd woven before driving her to their house 6 hours ago. She was 9 years old with brown eyes that never seemed to focus on anything, and a smile that came at inappropriate moments. Mr. Calderon pushed the envelope containing my $15,000 back into my hands and said in a voice that kept breaking that they couldn't keep her, that I'd lied about everything, that Maya had seriously injured their son, and they were taking him to the emergency room as soon as they left here. I asked what happened, and Mrs. Calderon started crying and said Maya had attacked Mateo unprovoked within an hour of being in their home. I'd found the Calderons through a woman named Vera Lansky, who ran an underground adoption network for parents who needed to rehome children through channels that didn't involve courts or social workers or official records. Vera specialized in matching desperate parents with couples willing to take difficult children for the right price. The Calderons had wanted a daughter for years after their son Mateo was born, but Mrs. Calderon's medical complications made pregnancy impossible. They'd been rejected by legitimate adoption agencies due to Mr. Calderon's prior bankruptcy and some legal issues from his 20s. Vera had assured me they were good people who'd give Maya stability and opportunities I couldn't provide. I'd paid Vera's fee of $8,000 plus the $15,000 the Calderons requested to cover legal costs for creating new documentation. Maya was supposed to become their biological daughter on paper with a forged birth certificate and sealed records. It was supposed to be permanent and irreversible and put 500 miles between us. Mrs. Calderon explained through sobs that they'd brought Maya home and introduced her to Mateo, who was 7 and excited to finally have a sister. They'd left the children alone in the playroom for 30 minutes while they unpacked Maya's things. When they came back to check on them, Mateo was on the floor bleeding from a head wound, and Maya was standing over him holding a wooden toy train. They'd rushed to Mateo and found a gash on his temple that would need stitches. When they'd asked what happened, Maya had said calmly that Mateo had touched her things without permission, so she hit him. She'd shown no remorse or concern, just stated it as a fact. Mr. Calderon said they'd tried to explain that hitting was wrong, but Maya had stared at them blankly and said she understood rules, but didn't agree with rules that let other people touch her belongings. They'd realized then that something was fundamentally wrong with how Maya understood social behavior. The truth was, Maya had hurt people before. My boyfriend Daniel had broken up with me 8 months ago after Maya had bitten him hard enough to break skin when he'd tried to hug her goodbye. He'd needed a tetanus shot and antibiotics for the infection that developed. He'd said Maya had looked him in the eyes while biting down and hadn't stopped even when he'd screamed. I'd tried to explain that Maya had trauma from her father's abuse before he'd left us, but Daniel said the look in her eyes wasn't fear or defense. It was calculation and enjoyment. He'd filed a restraining order and left. Before Daniel, there was my mother who'd lived with us for 3 months before demanding to leave suddenly. She'd called me a week later and said Maya had pushed her down the stairs when my mother had told her to clean her room. My mother had fractured her wrist and hip. She'd refused to press charges, but also refused all contact with us afterward. There had been others. Maya's teacher at school had taken sudden medical leave after Maya had stabbed her in the hand with scissors during art class. The teacher required surgery to repair tendon damage. Another parent had confronted me at pickup claiming Maya had broken her daughter's fingers by slamming them in a door during a playdate. The school counselor had recommended psychiatric evaluation, but I'd withdrawn Maya before any formal assessment. I'd homeschooled her for a year while researching what could be wrong with a child who injured people seemingly without provocation and showed no remorse afterward. Every psychologist I'd consulted online or in brief consultations had mentioned conduct disorder or early signs of antisocial personality disorder, but none would formally diagnose a child under 10. They'd all recommended intensive residential treatment, which I couldn't afford, and which would create a paper trail that would follow Maya forever. I'd contacted Vera Lansky after concluding that traditional systems couldn't help Maya, and I couldn't safely keep her. Vera had listened to my vague explanations about Maya's behavioral difficulties and found the Calderons who were desperate enough to take a 9-year-old with limited background information. I told them Maya was shy and had trouble bonding, but nothing about the pattern of violence she left behind. I'd believed if Maya started fresh with people who didn't know her history, maybe things would be different. 6 hours had proven that theory catastrophically wrong. Now the Calderons were returning her and threatening to report everything to authorities regardless of the legal consequences for themselves. Mr. Calderon said his son's injury and the trauma of being attacked by his new sister was worth more than protecting himself from prosecution for illegal adoption. Mrs. Calderon said they were taking Mateo to the hospital and would tell doctors exactly what happened. They drove away and I watched their taillights disappear, feeling the weight of complete failure. Maya walked past me into the house and went directly to her bedroom without speaking. I followed and found her sitting on her bed arranging her stuffed animals in a precise line. I asked why she hurt Mateo, and she said in her flat voice that he'd touched her toy box without asking permission. I explained that siblings share things and he was trying to be friendly, but Maya shook her head and said ownership rules were clear and Mateo had violated them. I asked if she understood that hurting him was wrong, and she said she understood other people thought it was wrong, but she disagreed with that assessment. In her view, protecting property rights was more important than avoiding minor physical harm to people who violated those rights. She spoke like an adult, presenting a logical argument completely disconnected from the reality that she was 9 years old, discussing why she'd hit a 7-year-old with a wooden train. And I sat on the floor trying to process what I was dealing with. Maya had no capacity for empathy or remorse. She understood rules intellectually, but only followed them when consequences directly affected her. She'd learned to mimic appropriate emotional responses when necessary, but the underlying feeling was absent. I'd read about children like this in psychology articles, kids whose brains were wired differently from birth, who never developed normal attachment or moral reasoning. Most articles emphasized early intervention and intensive treatment, but acknowledged that many never developed normal empathy, regardless of intervention. Maya was 9 and had shown these patterns since she was a toddler. Every professional who'd interacted with her briefly had recognized something was fundamentally wrong. I'd been in denial, hoping she'd grow out of it, but watching her calmly arrange stuffed animals after sending a child to the emergency room made denial impossible. I called Vera Lansky's emergency number and left a message saying the adoption had failed and I needed immediate alternatives. Vera called back at 2 in the morning and said she'd heard from the Calderones and understood the situation was more serious than I'd disclosed. She said she had one other option, but it was expensive and extreme. There was a private boarding school in Montana that specialized in children with severe behavioral problems that mainstream schools and programs couldn't handle. The school was essentially a locked facility that housed children whose parents had given up on traditional treatment. It cost $30,000 per year and operated under minimal oversight. Parents signed guardianship over to the school and had limited contact rights. Vera said she could arrange placement within a week if I could secure funding and was willing to permanently relinquish custody. I had $18,000 in savings and could borrow from my retirement account to reach $30,000. I told Vera to make arrangements, and she said she'd contact the school director, Dr. Isaiah Wolcott, who handled intake. She warned me that once Maya was placed, I'd have almost no contact with her, because the school prioritized security and control over family relationships. Parents who placed children there typically never saw them again except in medical emergencies. I said I understood and wanted to proceed. Vera said Dr. Wolcott would call within 48 hours. I hung up and found Maya standing in my doorway, watching me with that blank expression. She asked if I was sending her away again, and I said yes. Maya nodded and said that made sense since I couldn't manage her and normal places wouldn't take her. She asked if she'd see me again, and I said probably not. Maya said that was fine, that our relationship had never been important to her anyway. Dr. Wolcott called the following evening and asked detailed questions about Maya's history and behavior. I explained everything, including the violence, the lack of remorse, the inability to form attachments, the failed treatments. Dr. Wolcott listened without interruption, and when I finished, he said Maya's profile matched other students at his school. He specialized in children with severe conduct disorder and antisocial traits who'd exhausted other options. His facility provided structure, consequences, and isolation from society while these children matured. He was honest that most never developed normal empathy, but some learned to control their behavior well enough to function in society eventually. He said the cost was $30,000 annually with no refunds and no family contact for at least 2 years. After that, I could request supervised visits if Maya's treatment team approved. I agreed to all terms and wired the money that same night. 2 days later, a transport team arrived to collect Maya. They were 2 women in professional attire who showed credentials from Dr. Wolcott's school and explained the transport process. Maya would travel in a specialized vehicle designed for transporting high-risk juveniles. She'd be restrained for safety during the 10-hour drive and monitored constantly. I signed custody transfer documents that looked official, but later realized were probably worthless forgeries. I watched them guide Maya to their van, and she didn't resist or protest, just walked calmly and climbed into the vehicle when directed. One woman assured me Maya would arrive safely and begin orientation immediately. The van pulled away and I stood in my empty house feeling nothing except relief mixed with guilt. I'd just given away my daughter to strangers who'd lock her up indefinitely because I couldn't handle what she was. I went inside and poured myself a glass of wine and drank it, standing at the kitchen sink staring at nothing. The school sent quarterly reports for the first year detailing Maya's adjustment. She followed rules when consequences were clearly defined but showed no internal motivation to behave appropriately. She participated in therapy, but staff noted she was simply learning what responses earned privileges rather than developing genuine insight. She had no friends among other students and showed no interest in forming connections. The reports painted a picture of a child going through motions without any real change in her fundamental nature. I read each report with distant detachment and filed them in a folder I kept in the back of my closet. Maya was no longer my problem, and I was rebuilding my life without her. I started dating someone named Kevin who worked in pharmaceutical sales and didn't know I'd ever had a child. I told people I was child-free by choice, and nobody questioned it because I was only 28 and looked younger. 18 months after Maya's placement, I received a call from Dr. Wolcott saying there'd been an incident. Maya had seriously injured another student during a supervised recreation period. She'd pushed the girl down concrete stairs, causing a fractured skull and broken arm. When staff had questioned Maya, she'd said the girl had been standing in her way and refused to move, so Maya had moved her. She'd shown no remorse or understanding of the severity of the injury. Dr. Wolcott said they were transferring Maya to a more secure unit within the facility and extending her placement indefinitely. He said honestly that children like Maya rarely left his school before age 18, and some remained in adult psychiatric facilities afterward if they continued to pose a danger. He asked if I understood Maya would likely be institutionalized for most of her childhood, and possibly longer. I said I understood and didn't request any changes to the arrangement. I asked him not to call again unless Maya died or escaped. He agreed, and I hung up feeling hollow. 3 years passed without contact from the school. I received annual statements confirming my payments were current, but no updates on Maya's condition or behavior. I'd moved to a different city and started a new career in marketing and gotten engaged to Kevin, who still didn't know about Maya. I'd convinced myself that chapter of my life was closed permanently, and I could build a future without the constant fear of what my daughter might do next. Then I received a registered letter from an attorney named Thomas Grayson, representing Maya Reyes, my daughter. The letter stated that Maya was now 13 years old and had filed a petition through the school's legal aid program requesting contact with me. The petition claimed she'd made significant progress in treatment, and her therapeutic team supported supervised family reunification as part of her rehabilitation. The letter requested I respond within 30 days indicating whether I'd agree to participate in family therapy sessions. I ignored the letter and blocked Thomas Grayson's phone number when he called repeatedly over the next 2 weeks. I told Kevin I was getting spam calls from a debt collector and changed my number completely. A month later, Child Protective Services contacted me at work, saying they were investigating Maya's placement and needed to verify that I'd legally transferred custody and that the arrangement was appropriate. A caseworker named Denise Yamamoto visited my apartment after I got off work and asked detailed questions about why I'd placed Maya in Dr. Wolcott's school and whether I maintained any relationship with her. I explained Maya's history of violence and my inability to safely manage her behavior. I showed her the folder of reports from the school documenting Maya's continued dangerous behavior and lack of progress. Denise looked through the reports with a deepening frown and said CPS had received multiple complaints about Dr. Wolcott's facility, alleging that it operated without proper licensing and used excessive restraint and isolation on students. They were investigating whether children placed there were being properly cared for or were essentially imprisoned without adequate oversight. She asked if I'd ever visited the facility or verified the credentials of staff members. I admitted I hadn't because I'd wanted distance from Maya and had trusted Vera Lansky's assurances that the school was legitimate. Denise said Vera Lansky was actually under investigation for operating an illegal adoption ring, and several parents who'd used her services were facing criminal charges. She asked if I'd be willing to cooperate in a review of Maya's placement and potentially face consequences for using Vera's services. I told Denise I'd signed custody transfer documents and whatever happened at the school was no longer my responsibility. Denise said legally I was still Maya's parent, and the custody transfer documents weren't enforceable under state law. Private agreements to relinquish parental rights without court involvement were void. I was still legally responsible for Maya, and could face charges for abandonment or for placing her in an unlicensed facility that might be abusing her. She said CPS was offering me an opportunity to cooperate in transitioning Maya to a legitimate placement, or I could face legal consequences including potential jail time. I asked what kind of legitimate placement existed for a violent child who'd failed every traditional program and had hurt multiple people. Denise said there were state-run residential treatment centers designed for exactly these cases. They were properly licensed and regulated and provided appropriate care while ensuring public safety. 3 months later, Maya was transferred from Dr. Wolcott's school to Valley Ridge Youth Treatment Center, a state facility 2 hours from my new home. The transfer happened after state authorities raided Dr. Wolcott's facility and discovered that children were being kept in isolation cells for weeks at a time, denied adequate food, and physically restrained in ways that caused injury. Dr. Wolcott and 4 staff members were arrested, and the facility was permanently shut down. I was required to participate in monthly family therapy sessions as part of the court-ordered treatment plan. The first session was supervised by a therapist named Dr. Angela Ramsey, who specialized in adolescents with conduct disorders. Maya walked into the therapy room looking taller and thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes and a hardness to her expression that hadn't been there before. She sat across from me and stared without speaking for the first 10 minutes. Dr. Ramsey explained that Maya had been through significant trauma at Dr. Wolcott's facility, including extended periods of isolation and physical restraints. The facility had been shut down by state authorities, and multiple staff members faced criminal charges for child abuse. Maya and 11 other students had been rescued and placed in appropriate care. Dr. Ramsey said Maya was angry at me for placing her in that situation and abandoning her there for 3 years. She said Maya's violent behavior had worsened during her time at Dr. Wolcott's school because the environment had been abusive rather than therapeutic. Maya needed to express her feelings about what I'd done, and I needed to take responsibility for my choices. I looked at Maya and saw real emotion on her face for the first time in years, genuine anger rather than the blank affect I'd always known. She said in a shaking voice that she'd been locked in a room by herself for months at a time at Dr. Wolcott's school. That staff had restrained her face down on the floor until she couldn't breathe. That she'd been denied food as punishment and forced to use a bucket as a toilet when they wouldn't let her out to use the bathroom. She said she'd deserved consequences for hurting people, but she hadn't deserved torture. And I'd paid people to torture her, then disappeared from her life completely without checking on her welfare once. She said she'd spent 3 years believing I'd knowingly sent her somewhere abusive because I hated her that much. I told her I hadn't known the school was abusive, that I'd believed she was receiving proper treatment in a secure environment. Maya said I hadn't cared what happened to her as long as she was gone. She was right. I'd wanted her erased from my life and hadn't asked questions about where she'd end up or what methods they used to control violent children. Dr. Ramsey said we needed to work through this trauma together and rebuild some form of relationship even if it was limited. I said I didn't think that was possible or productive. Maya had hurt people before Dr. Wolcott's school and would likely hurt people after. Sending her somewhere awful was wrong, but keeping her with me had also been impossible. Dr. Ramsey said that was defeatist thinking and Maya deserved a chance at rehabilitation with proper support. I looked at Maya and saw hatred burning in her eyes. Not the blank disinterest I'd known her entire childhood, but real burning hatred directed specifically at me. I realized the abuse at Dr. Wolcott's school had given her the one thing she'd never had before, a genuine emotional connection to another person, even if that connection was pure rage toward me. Dr. Ramsey saw my expression and asked what I was thinking. I said honestly that I was relieved Maya could finally feel something real even if it was hatred. That made Maya angrier, and she stood up and said I was pathetic, that I'd spent her entire life wanting her to be normal, and now I was celebrating that torture had made her emotional. She said she'd never forgive me, and these therapy sessions were pointless. Dr. Ramsey convinced her to sit back down, and we spent the rest of the session in tense silence. Over the following months, I attended required therapy sessions and watched Maya work through her anger, while also displaying the same fundamental lack of empathy that had always defined her. She was angry about her own suffering, but showed no remorse for the people she'd hurt over the years. She viewed herself purely as a victim of my abandonment, but didn't connect that to the fact that she'd made living with her impossible through constant violence toward anyone who came near her. Dr. Ramsey tried to help Maya develop insight into how her behavior affected others, but Maya only learned to say the right things without actually feeling them. She could recite that hitting people was wrong and that she should have controlled her impulses, but when pressed about whether she actually felt remorse, she'd admit she didn't. She just understood that claiming remorse earned her privileges. By month 6, Maya had convinced her treatment team she'd made sufficient progress to transition to a less restrictive group home. She'd be living in a supervised residential setting with 5 other teens and attending public school with support services. I objected during the placement meeting, saying Maya was good at mimicking progress without actual change, but the treatment team overrode me. They said Maya had a right to step down placement after demonstrating behavioral control for 6 months. Dr. Ramsey said I was being overly pessimistic and needed to give Maya a chance to succeed in a more normalized environment. The group home placement was approved, and Maya moved out of Valley Ridge on a cloudy morning in October. I watched her leave with her few belongings in a black garbage bag and felt certain this would end badly. The group home placement lasted 4 months before Maya assaulted a staff member who'd told her she couldn't leave the property without permission. Maya had wanted to walk to a convenience store, and the staff member had explained the rules about supervised outings. Maya had punched the staff member in the face, breaking her nose, and then walked out the door while the woman bled on the floor. Police had arrested Maya 3 blocks away, and she'd been charged with assault and battery. At age 14, she entered the juvenile justice system and was placed in a detention facility pending trial. Her public defender contacted me asking if I'd testify on Maya's behalf about her history and the trauma at Dr. Wolcott's school. I refused because I knew Maya had assaulted the staff member deliberately, and nothing about her past excused that choice. The judge sentenced Maya to 3 years in juvenile detention with mandatory psychiatric treatment. I received monthly updates on her status for the first year, which documented that she'd been involved in multiple fights with other detainees and had spent significant time in isolation for disciplinary reasons. After the first year, I requested no further contact. Maya would turn 18 in detention and would be released as an adult with a criminal record and years of institutional trauma added to whatever had been wrong with her from birth. I tried not to think about what kind of person she'd become by the time she was released. I knew statistically that children with severe conduct disorder who entered the juvenile justice system rarely improved and often graduated to adult prison. I married Kevin 6 months after Maya was sentenced, and we moved across the country to Seattle where Kevin had accepted a promotion. I told him the truth about Maya before we married because he deserved to know what he was marrying into. I explained everything from Maya's early violence to the failed adoption to Dr. Wolcott's abuse to her current incarceration. Kevin listened without judgment and said it wasn't my fault that Maya was born with whatever neurological differences made her incapable of normal bonding and empathy. He said I'd done everything I reasonably could, and that sometimes there are no good solutions to impossible situations. We agreed we'd have children of our own, and I'd monitor them carefully for any signs of Maya's traits. If I saw concerning patterns early enough, maybe intervention would work better than it had with Maya. We had a son named Lucas, and then a daughter named Sophie, and I monitored them obsessively for signs of Maya's coldness and violence. Both children were normal, empathetic, attached to Kevin and me in ways Maya had never been attached to anyone. Lucas cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant, and Sophie shared her toys without being told. I felt relief but also guilt that I had 2 healthy children while my first daughter was in detention, becoming more damaged with each passing year. I'd saved 2 children by having them with Kevin, but I'd failed to save Maya, who'd been my responsibility first. Kevin would find me sometimes staring at Lucas or Sophie with tears in my eyes, and he'd know I was thinking about Maya and what she could have been if her brain had been wired differently. When Maya turned 18, the state sent notification that she'd been released from custody and was living in a transitional housing program for former juvenile offenders. They included her contact information in case I wanted to reach out, and also warned that she'd been classified as high risk for reoffending, based on her institutional record. I threw the letter away and didn't tell Kevin it had arrived. I didn't want Maya anywhere near our children or our life. I changed my phone number again and made sure all our social media accounts were locked down with privacy settings. I told myself Maya would move on with her own life and never try to contact me since she'd never shown any attachment to me anyway. 5 years passed, and I convinced myself Maya had disappeared into her own life somewhere far from us. Lucas was 8 and Sophie was 6, and we were living a normal suburban life in Seattle. Then Maya found me through Facebook despite all my privacy settings. She'd created a fake profile and sent me a friend request under a different name. Once I'd accepted, she'd messaged saying she knew it was me and she wanted to meet. She said she'd spent her 20s in and out of jail for assault charges and drug possession. She'd finally gotten stable with the help of a forensic psychologist who specialized in people with antisocial personality disorder. She wasn't cured and never would be, but she'd learned to manage her impulses well enough to stay out of prison for the past 18 months. She said she wanted to meet not to reconcile or ask for money or insert herself into my life, but to tell me something she'd figured out in therapy. She said she understood now why I'd given her away, and why I'd chosen to save myself rather than destroy my life trying to fix something unfixable. She said she'd never been capable of being my daughter in any meaningful sense, and forcing the relationship had damaged us both. She said she forgave me not because forgiveness meant anything to her emotionally, but because intellectually she recognized I'd done what I'd needed to do to survive having her. She said she wanted to meet once so we could both acknowledge the reality of what our relationship had been, and then we'd never contact each other again. I agonized over the decision for 2 weeks. Kevin said it was my choice, but he was concerned about Maya learning where we lived or trying to meet our children. I decided to meet her in a public place during daytime with Kevin knowing exactly where I was in case something went wrong. I met Maya at a coffee shop downtown 6 months after her initial message. I barely recognized the 28-year-old woman sitting at a corner table. Maya looked tired and hard in ways that had nothing to do with age. Her hair was cut short and dyed black, and she had a scar across her left eyebrow that looked like she'd been hit with something. She wore jeans and a plain t-shirt and sat with her back to the wall, watching everyone in the coffee shop with calculated awareness. She explained that she worked in data entry for a company that hired people with criminal records and lived alone in a studio apartment. She took medication that helped with impulse control, but didn't change her fundamental nature. She said she'd spent years angry at me, but anger required energy she didn't have anymore. She'd contacted me to close the loop, to confirm that we were both better off apart, and that what I'd done by trying to give her away had been understandable, even if the execution had been terrible. I asked if she still hurt people, and she said honestly that she did when they provoked her, but she'd learned to choose situations where provocation was unlikely. She worked from home most days, and avoided social interaction and had a criminal record that served as strong motivation to maintain control, because one more assault charge would send her to prison long term. I asked what kind of life that was, being completely alone and avoiding all human connection. Maya said it was the only life she was capable of living without causing harm. She said her therapist had helped her accept that she'd never have relationships or family or the normal markers of a successful adult life. She'd never feel love or real happiness or the emotional connections that motivated most people. She experienced life as a series of logical decisions about minimizing negative consequences while pursuing basic survival. It sounded bleak to me, but Maya said she didn't experience it as bleak because she didn't have the emotional framework to feel despair about missing things she'd never been capable of experiencing. She was neutral about her existence, and that was as good as it would ever get for her. We sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours, having the most honest conversation we'd ever had. Maya wasn't asking for a relationship or forgiveness or money or anything, except acknowledgement that I'd made the only rational choice available given the circumstances. I told her I was sorry for sending her to Dr. Wolcott's school without proper research, that she'd deserved better even if living with me hadn't been sustainable. Maya shrugged and said the abuse had been unpleasant but hadn't fundamentally changed her. She'd been incapable of normal empathy before Dr. Wolcott and remained incapable after. The only difference was she'd learned through repeated punishment that controlling her violent impulses was necessary for basic survival in society. She asked if I had other children, and I hesitated before admitting I had 2. Maya said she wouldn't try to contact them or insert herself into my family. She understood that exposing normal children to someone like her would be harmful and pointless. She said she'd wanted to meet me this one time to tell me that I'd made the right choice prioritizing my own survival, and that I shouldn't carry guilt about failing to save her, because she'd never been savable. Her condition was hardwired from birth, and no amount of love or proper parenting would have changed that. She stood to leave and said she wouldn't contact me again because there was no point. We weren't mother and daughter in any real sense, and pretending otherwise benefited neither of us. I watched her walk out of the coffee shop and get into a beat-up car that looked like it barely ran. She drove away, and I sat there for another 30 minutes trying to process what had just happened. Maya had given me absolution for abandoning her, but the absolution came from someone incapable of genuine forgiveness, so it felt hollow. I went home and told Kevin about the meeting, and he held me while I cried for the first time in years about Maya. I wasn't crying from grief exactly, but from the weight of knowing I'd brought a person into the world who was fundamentally broken, and there had never been anything I could do to fix that. Kevin said I'd done my best in an impossible situation and that Maya seemed to be managing her life as well as someone with her condition could manage. That night, I checked on Lucas and Sophie while they slept, and felt overwhelming gratitude that they'd been born normal and capable of love and connection. I knew statistically that children like Maya were rare, that most children with conduct disorder had trauma or environmental factors contributing to their behavior. Maya had been the exception, born with neurological differences that made her incapable of the empathy and attachment that defined humanity. I'd spent 9 years trying to force her to be something she couldn't be, and then another decade trying to forget she existed. The meeting with adult Maya had brought everything full circle and confirmed that the day I'd tried to give her away had been the beginning of both of us accepting the reality that we were better off separated permanently. 15 years later, I was 48 years old with adult children of my own and a stable life I'd built deliberately after the chaos of Maya's childhood. Lucas was in medical school and Sophie was finishing her teaching degree, and both were in healthy relationships. I'd gotten divorced from Kevin 5 years ago for reasons unrelated to Maya, but we remained friendly. I was dating someone new named Richard, who knew about Maya and had read articles I'd saved about children with severe conduct disorder. Richard worked in criminal justice reform and understood that some people were born with neurological differences that made them dangerous regardless of intervention. He said the system had no good answers for people like Maya who weren't psychotic or intellectually disabled, but also weren't capable of functioning safely in society without constant oversight. I'd thought about Maya occasionally over the years, but hadn't tried to contact her or search for information about her. Then her name appeared in a news article Richard showed me about a woman arrested for assault in Portland. Maya Reyes, age 43, had been charged with aggravated assault after attacking a co-worker who'd allegedly made a comment about her work performance. The victim had required hospitalization for facial fractures, and Maya was being held without bail due to her extensive criminal history. The article noted this was her 5th assault charge in 20 years, and prosecutors were pursuing enhanced sentencing. Richard asked if this was my daughter, and I confirmed it was. He said Maya would likely receive a significant prison sentence given her record and the severity of the injury. I didn't attend the trial or contact Maya's public defender. I felt distant sadness knowing that Maya had ended up exactly where everyone had predicted she would end up. Despite therapy and medication and her own stated desire to avoid prison, she'd been unable to control her violence when provoked. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for at least 8 years. I received notification of the sentence because I was still listed as her next of kin in state records. The notification included information about visitation rights and how to send letters to inmates. I threw the notification away and told no one except Richard that Maya had been sentenced. This was where her story had always been heading, and there was nothing I could do about it now. 2 years into Maya's sentence, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. The return address was Oregon State Correctional Facility, and the handwriting on the envelope was Maya's. I almost threw it away without opening, but something made me read it. Maya had written that she wasn't asking for anything or expecting a response, but wanted me to know she'd been diagnosed with a brain tumor. The prison doctor said it was inoperable due to its location and she had maybe 6 months to a year left. Maya said she was writing because she had no one else to notify and thought I should know my daughter was dying. She said she'd spent her entire life feeling nothing genuine for anyone, and was now facing death with the same emotional emptiness. She said she wondered sometimes what it would have been like to be born normal, to experience love and connection. But those thoughts were intellectual exercises rather than actual longings. She said she didn't blame me for her life, or for staying away after she was imprisoned. She said rationally she understood that I'd done what any reasonable person would do when faced with a child who was fundamentally incompatible with normal family life. She said she hoped I'd managed to build a good life, and that my other children had turned out normal. She said she wouldn't write again, and I shouldn't feel obligated to respond or visit. She was telling me as a factual notification, the way you'd inform someone that a distant relative had died. She signed the letter with just her name, no terms of affection or closing sentiments. I read the letter 3 times and then filed it in the folder with her old school reports and court documents. I told Lucas and Sophie about Maya for the first time that evening. They were 28 and 26, and had never known they had an older half-sister. I explained everything from Maya's birth through her violence, through my attempt to give her away through her current imprisonment and terminal illness. Lucas was horrified and Sophie cried. They asked why I'd never told them, and I said I'd wanted to protect them from the knowledge that they could have been born like Maya, that genetics were arbitrary and they'd gotten lucky while she hadn't. Sophie asked if I was going to visit Maya before she died, and I said I didn't know. Lucas said I should go so I wouldn't regret it later. Sophie said Maya probably wanted to see me even if she couldn't articulate that want in a normal way. I flew to Oregon 3 weeks later and drove to the correctional facility where Maya was housed in the medical unit. I went through security and was led to a visiting room designed for inmates with medical conditions. Maya was brought in wearing prison scrubs and looking skeletal. The tumor had affected her mobility, and she moved slowly with a guard helping her to the chair across from me. We sat separated by a table with a guard watching from the corner. Maya looked at me without expression and said she was surprised I came. I said Lucas and Sophie had convinced me I should. Maya asked about them, and I showed her photos on my phone. She looked at the pictures of her half-siblings without visible emotion and said they looked happy and normal. I confirmed they were both doing well and had good lives. We sat in silence for a few minutes, before Maya said she'd been thinking about our last meeting 15 years ago. She said she'd told me then that I'd made the right choice, and she still believed that intellectually. But spending time in prison had shown her what happened to people like her when society gave up on them completely. She said the prison system was full of people with untreated personality disorders and neurological problems who'd been discarded by families and institutions. She said maybe if she'd been born 20 years later when they understood brain development better, she might have received different treatment. Or maybe she'd still have ended up exactly here because some problems were unsolvable regardless of intervention. She said she didn't know, and it didn't matter now because she was dying anyway. I asked if she was in pain, and she said the tumor caused headaches, but prison medical gave her enough painkillers to make it bearable. I asked if she was afraid of dying, and she said no, because she'd never been afraid of anything in the normal sense. She experienced the concept of death as an abstract endpoint, but without the emotional weight most people attach to it. She said dying would be a relief from having to manage her impulses constantly. She'd spent 43 years controlling violent urges and maintaining enough behavioral control to avoid being permanently institutionalized, and now she could stop trying. I told her that sounded exhausting, and she said it had been, but she'd had no choice if she wanted any autonomy at all. The guard said we had 5 minutes left, and Maya asked if I'd handle her body after she died. The prison would cremate her at state expense, but someone needed to claim the ashes or they'd be disposed of in a mass grave. I said I'd claim them, and asked if she had any preference for what I did with them. Maya said she didn't care, that she'd be dead and wouldn't have opinions about anything anymore. She said to do whatever was easiest for me. I promised I'd scatter her ashes somewhere peaceful, and she nodded without reaction. The guard came to take her back to the medical unit, and Maya stood slowly. She looked at me one last time and said, "Thank you for coming." I said I was sorry things had turned out this way, and she said outcomes were just outcomes, neither good nor bad. She left with the guard, and I sat in the visiting room alone trying to process that this would likely be the last time I saw my daughter alive. Maya died 4 months later from complications of the brain tumor. The prison called to notify me and sent paperwork about claiming her remains. I flew back to Oregon and picked up a small box containing Maya's ashes from the prison administrative office. I drove to the coast and scattered her ashes in the ocean from a quiet beach on a gray afternoon. I stood watching the waves carry the ashes away and felt a strange mix of relief and grief. Maya had been born wrong through no fault of her own or mine. She'd lived 43 years struggling to exist in a world designed for people with empathy and emotional connections she'd never possessed. She'd hurt people and been hurt and ended up in prison where she'd died alone. Nothing about her story was fair or just or offered any satisfying moral resolution. It simply was what it was, a tragedy of biology and circumstance that no amount of intervention had been able to prevent. I drove back to the airport and flew home to my normal life knowing that Maya's story had finally ended and I could stop carrying the weight of wondering what had become of her. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.